right, so I am your host today. My name is Leah Lutz, and I'm the Collaboration Specialist and the Teaching and Connections Coordinator here at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition. We have a grant through the Office on Violence Against Women who are making this webinar possible today, and to also provide technical assistance and support to you in your community as well. So I also just want all of you to know that we're available, and feel free to give me a call or email me, whatever your preference may be. And I'm very, very excited for today's topic, and I want to welcome folks from the West Virginia Foundation for Rape Information and Services. Really feel fortunate to have worked with Marcia Kisner and Sam Wilmoth on developing this webinar, hearing their expertise, their perspective, and just their wisdom and insight in general as we're developing our program at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute to reach out to all of you in the rural community. They have expertise both with SARTs and with the rural dynamics and rural communities. And Marcia and Sam, just a sincere thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Leah. I really appreciate it. My name is Sam Wilmoth, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming. I want to begin the presentation by discussing a little bit about what FRIZ does and what FRIZ is. West Virginia FRIZ is the Coalition Against Sexual Assault in West Virginia, and because we have a relatively small state, we do have a statewide focus, and we're able to assist communities both locally and with broader policy initiatives, some of which we're going to talk about later. We want to emphasize, too, that we understand that SARTs can look different in every state, in every community, and so can coalitions. So while we certainly hope that there's a lot in our own experience that's going to be helpful to you all, we know that there's going to be certain things that are different, certain challenges, certain strengths. And we definitely invite you to ask questions or to leave comments, and we'll leave a pretty lengthy period of time at the end of the webinar for that, or even for interjections, because I think that dialogue is incredibly important. Unfortunately, one thing that we know that all of our communities have in common is a recent past of systemic failure to meet victims' needs. This is the reason that we're all in this line of work. And we really believe at West Virginia FRIZ that SARTs represent really, the best hope for improving outcomes for victims, for coordinating prevention efforts, and for making the kinds of system changes that leave lasting impacts on the lives of the people in our community. So what we're going to do is we're going to share some of the successes and challenges that we've had in West Virginia, and hope that in the course of the discussion that there might be things that will be helpful for other folks in rural communities for establishing and sustaining SARTs. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Marcia Kisner, who works with our rural grant, and thank you very much again for having us.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everybody. This is Marcia Kisner, and thank you for having me as well. I want to go ahead and get started and discuss some of the objectives that we hope to cover today. Once the community recognizes that there's an interest for developing a SART team or any type of a coordinated response to sexual assault, it's necessary to develop a plan for the development, the implementation, but also the sustainability of that SART. So today we're going to discuss ways to assist you that might help you to, if you don't already have an existing SART, to develop that type of coordinated response. We hope to explore the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration, discuss challenges unique in rural settings, also review lessons learned from protocol development that we have learned firsthand here in West Virginia. Also, we hope to discuss the importance of a victim-centered response and learn about the goals of successful SARTs here in our state. So going back to SART 101, what is a sexual assault response team? A sexual assault response team is a multidisciplinary collaboration that brings its members together to provide a coordinated victim-centered approach to the intervention and care for sexual assault survivors. SARTs are most commonly made up of key players, and some of those core members or key players include an advocate, sexual assault nurse examiner. Of course, you always have your law enforcement, prosecutors. Each community, as Sam said, is different. So you're going to have different people to the table, and you're going to have challenges when it comes to getting some of those people to the table. But what we like to say here in West Virginia is it takes time. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, but eventually it gets there. Communities may benefit from other community members such as 911 dispatchers, EMTs. We have a large population of EMTs that are members of some of our SARTs here in West Virginia. Also thinking outside of the box for other service providers such as APS and CPS and some standalone disability service providers in the community. Some other core members also include faith-based representatives, anyone who works within an organization that might serve as an entry point to the service delivery system. SARTs are not a new concept. Initially, SARTs were created in the 1970s. Some are called SARTs, some are called CCRs, Coordinated Community Response. It's just a more unified response to sexual assault. Some of the teams were initially hospital-based, some originated within police departments, and some of the other teams began on college campuses. Some of the teams were aimed to eliminate long waits in the ER, reduce repetitive questioning, the amount of re-traumatization to the victim. So what does a SART do? SARTs work to promote the development and implementation of a victim-centered response. And in saying that, I want to reiterate what Sam said, is no response is going to be the same in any county, especially when you're dealing with rural areas. Every SART team is modeled differently. There are best practices and guidelines, but every SART functions differently. The victim-centered response is the important thing to remember. It acknowledges that justice represents more than just a successful prosecution. It's an important part to make the victims experience justice regardless of the legal outcome. Justice exists when victims are believed, and a lot of times that is the biggest challenge, is promoting the victim-centered response is simply believing the victim. SARTs also form to evaluate the response of the sexual assault response in their county. You know, what are we doing in our county? Is it working? What's not working? These are some of the things that SARTs discuss. And in doing so, the SARTs that we see, that we have actively participating here in West Virginia, they meet at least quarterly, and when they come to the table, these are some of the things that they decide. SARTs are working to develop protocols, protocols for first responding agencies that are supported by working agreements. You know, can we meet regularly, and can we keep confidentiality at the core? There is no one-size-fits-all. There's all kinds of examples of SARTs throughout the country, and each has defined itself somewhat differently. There is no best model. There's no best practice. You have to keep at the center when developing your plan, you have to know what your community's needs are. What will work for your community? Who is at your table? And let those people weigh in. You know, not everybody might not buy into the same idea of what is needed or what is not needed. So when a SART works together as a team, you're going to develop your own plan, policy, or practice that is suitable for your community. And Sam, with that being said, I will turn that back over to you.
Sure. So we're going to talk a little bit about strengths and obstacles of rural communities. And This is where I'm really going to put on my social worker hat and remind everyone of why we want to be strength-focused. It's not because we're going to unmute the line in a second and we're all going to sing Kumbaya. It's because this really helps us with an accurate appraisal of what resources we have available to solve a problem. Many of you are familiar with the obstacles that face rural communities, and we're going to go over some of the ones that we've encountered here shortly. But if we're exclusively focused on those obstacles, that is, if we're only looking at the deficits that a community might face, then we're really going to miss some opportunities for creative thinking about solutions. So we know that most every rural community faces a few particular obstacles. But we also know that rural communities have incredible strengths and assets. And in the context of other problems, they've learned to navigate a system that often doesn't have the level of resources that we might like them to have. So let's talk about some of those strengths for a moment. There's quite a few things that rural communities actually do really rather well, and that can help mitigate some of the challenges that they can face in a coordinated response to sexual assault. One of the most important ones is that a lot of the folks that you want to be coordinating with on a SART already know each other, already have relationships. Now, certainly tensions can exist in those relationships, and we're going to talk about conflict resolution later in the presentation. But for the most part, this is a real asset that rural communities have that a lot of larger communities don't. So much of the initial process of forming a healthy and sustainable SART, so much of that early work really revolves around building relationships, on building trust. And to the extent that that might already have happened in a rural community, then it really can make that process faster and easier. Some of the reasons why this might happen are pretty obvious. In a small community, you're a lot more likely to encounter folks in other disciplines, both in professional life and everyday life. That's a real strength. The next one is this professional flexibility. A lot of folks in rural communities don't insist on adhering too rigidly to a set of professional boundaries. What a better way of saying it might be, you tend to hear, that's not my job, a lot less. Because folks in rural communities understand that they'll often have to be flexible about what they're willing to do to solve a problem in the absence of a lot of dedicated resources. For instance, we worked with a community that for quite a while only had one law enforcement officer. So needless to say, that person was the chief of police. Now, obviously that presents some challenges, which we'll cover later, but it does mean that particular law enforcement officer was a lot more willing than others to step outside the traditional boundaries of his role and help out. Informal support is also another big strength in rural communities, whether that's extended family or friends or neighbors. Some of those informal bonds can really be important if they're channeled in the right way towards helping a victim recover from trauma. And also, there's not a lot of confusion about what resources are available in rural communities compared to larger ones. So while we might wish that there were more options available for victims, very often resources for therapy after an assault or shelter are pretty well known in the community, and that can mean that accessing them is maybe a little bit easier. And this final bullet point is really important because I think it's really often overlooked. There's a real sense in which a SART in a larger community can become paralyzed by the absence of key players. So if you're in a very large county or very large city and you don't have key institutions represented, it's hard to make big system-wide policy changes. While in rural communities, oftentimes you're in a really great position to make huge differences by even making marginal improvements in the services available. And so that's, I think, a reason for optimism about working with rural communities, because small changes really can ripple through that community in a way that wouldn't necessarily happen in a larger one. But unfortunately, there are some obstacles as well, and many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with these. Folks in rural communities may not know how to make a report. This can really be a particular problem if first responders have some kind of direct connection with a potential perpetrator. So if, to take, for example, that community I mentioned before where there was only one law enforcement officer, if, a victim was assaulted by somebody who was close to that law enforcement officer in some way, the victim might be understandably hesitant to make a report in that situation. So those kinds of ties, even though they can be helpful in certain situations, can also be a hindrance. We know that geographical isolation is a pretty consistent problem for us. We have some counties, for instance, in which there is no hospital. And without access to transportation, which is that next bullet point down, it might be really rather difficult to get services. We've had cases where getting services to a victim might require fording a small stream or something like that, that you wouldn't really hear if you were working in Cook County somewhere. But there are nonetheless challenges that rural communities can face pretty regularly, and so we have to be creative about solutions for that. Another big problem can be the lack of anonymity. So if you know of a victim who's presenting in an emergency room and she happens to know every nurse who's on duty, that can obviously be a real problem in terms of feeling like confidentiality can be protected. And so that's something that we face on a regular basis. And finally, community backlash can be an issue in any community, but connected with the bullet point above it, with the idea that sometimes anonymity is harder to guarantee in rural communities, that means that backlash can be that much more of a problem. Certainly, we're cognizant of the fact that the Steubenville case that many of you are really familiar with sort of happened right in our backyard, and that is a particularly tragic and terrible example of what community backlash can do, particularly if it's amplified. So that's something that rural communities have to work against. Some other challenges is that for advocates in general, they can be stretched really thin. We often have situations where, just like that county with one law enforcement officer, we might also only have one advocate in a particular community. And that means that self-care is often really difficult to get. If you have one person who is called out for every sexual assault, the secondary trauma can just be a huge problem. And so for those of you who are administrators or who work in state coalitions, I just can't encourage you in strong enough terms to try to address that problem proactively. Whether that's getting creative with an on-call system, with vacation time, doing in-service that serves as a little bit of a break for employees, checking in with them, and trying to help them process particularly difficult cases. That's just so important in rural communities. And obviously the timing of that initial response to the sexual assault can really be thrown off when the resources for first responders are a little bit less extensive. So, all of us are going to have issues with this particular characterization, but it's one we've probably all heard. You have one or two law enforcement officers in a community, and they might attend to crimes or incidents that they think are more emergent than a sexual assault. So, for instance, a car accident in which there is an injury, and you can see the same in emergency rooms. And so what can end up happening is that wait times for victims can be longer under those circumstances. You might also find that the specialized services that we would prefer don't always exist in a rural community, and that might be particularly true for follow-up care. If you have one therapist in town and that person is not accustomed or for some reason well suited for working with a victim of sexual assault, that can be a real problem. One thing, too, that we have really tried to problem solve a lot in West Virginia is appropriate access to SANEs, to sexual assault nurse examiners. And that is, I think, a persistent problem in rural communities throughout the country. We're going to talk a little bit later about some of the things that we've done to try to address that. But we know that that's a perfect example of a specialized service that victims need and are not always given access to. And then finally, one of the biggest problems that small agencies face, I think, is turnover. We know that there are a lot of reasons why that happens. Certainly some of it can be pay. Some of it can be that secondary trauma piece that I was talking about before. But when one person leaves, and that one person was the face of the SART or was the strongest advocate for victims of sexual assault in the system, that can be a really damaging blow to a community's response to sexual assault. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marcia now, who's going to talk about the importance of having that coordinated response.
Thank you, Sam. So it is important to remember that the SART approach, the primary purpose of the SART is to ensure effective, also consistent and comprehensive and a collaborative response to sexual assault that prioritizes the needs of sexual assault victims and also holds offenders accountable. Some SARTs also include supporting or developing local sexual assault prevention strategies by incorporating the prevention programs within a community. So in layman's terms, it's important to remember that the most critical work of a SART is also to function as the vehicle for collaboration. It builds relationships, but then also provides education among and between professionals. An effective collaborative response also mitigates the effects of sexual assault on victims, and it increases the community as well as victim safety. So why are SARTs important? SARTs work to promote a victim-centered response to sexual assault, and victim-centered is always crucial when working with sexual assault victims. It's offender-focused, it reduces victim blaming. SARTs can diminish the short and long-term impacts of trauma by mobilizing interdisciplinary expertise and to address victims' needs from the acute stage to recovery. So partnerships formed by SARTs can validate victims' concerns. It can also inform victims of available options for addressing those concerns and improve those services. The team also can model to improve cross-discipline communication and enable victims to provide feedback on their cases. So more specifically, SARTs help victims by supporting victims during the invasive medical procedures. Those sex crimes kit collections are often difficult, and also difficult interviews. It also can help victims by supporting victims emotionally as they navigate the criminal justice system. As we know, that criminal justice system is complex and it's not easy to navigate. So designating specific facilities for forensic medical exams that make timely response a priority and offer victims privacy, because no one wants to sit in an emergency room for 3 hours waiting to be seen. And those are some of the things that SART teams work to mitigate, to reduce some of that trauma that's happening after the assault. SART also work to provide medical assessments and prophylactic treatment for sexually transmitted infections and to address reproductive health concerns. They can direct the victim where the victim needs to go to seek out those services. So SARTs work to build a network of community referrals to meet victims' practical, emotional, spiritual, and economic needs as well. They can direct a victim to temporary shelter, transportation, employment intervention, also assistance with home security and with restitution and victim compensation claims. Those are some of the reasons that SARTs are important.
And one of the things that we tell our SART coordinators and work with them a lot on is being able to make the argument for SARTs in a variety of different ways. I wish that the moral imperative of preventing sexual assault and treating survivors humanely would be as clear to everyone as it is to the folks who are on the line right now. I wish that argument were enough. But very frequently, in order to get folks to the table, we have to be prepared to justify the importance of a SART using other metrics or other ideas. So we will provide a lot of technical assistance to SART coordinators who are trying to get a particular agency to sit down at the table every month and participate in SART meetings. And that might be focusing on, say, the evidence that over the long term that SARTs can increase arrest rates for sexual violence. It might have to do with the tremendous financial costs that a community has to deal with this problem being as tragic as it is. It might be talking to a hospital administrator about improving responses as a logical step to reduce liability. So, there's lots of different ways that we can phrase this argument, and we need to be flexible in the way that we do that so that we can get as many folks to the table as possible. Now, there is one particular handout that I would really recommend that you can get it at the link below on that slide, and I know we're having some formatting difficulties with it being cut off a little bit, but you can see that quote there. In 2008, researchers estimated that each rape cost approximately $151,000 or $423. And sexual abuse has a negative impact on children's educational attainment, later job performance, and earnings. Now, obviously, limiting violence and promoting a compassionate response, an effective response, reducing trauma, that should be an end in and of itself. We shouldn't have to provide justifications for why we want to do that. But the bottom line for us is that we want to do what works. And ultimately, if doing a certain thing or phrasing an argument in a particular way helps get more people to the table and improve things for victims, then I want to be able to do that. And we definitely try to emphasize that with our SART coordinators across the state. So Marcia's going to just go ahead and talk about the guiding purpose of each SART.
Thanks, Sam. Every SART must have a purpose. Where are we starting? Where do we want to go? And how do we want to get there? So every county's guiding purpose should be reflective of the community's needs and provide a victim-centered approach to victims' needs that are specific to your own area. The guiding purpose of a SART will change as the SART grows and as the victim service is approved. And SARTs need to be owned, which have buy-in from your community in order for a SART to be sustainable. So the overall goal of the victim-centered approach is agencies must demonstrate a commitment to the goals of the victim and community safety, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to provide survivor emotional healing. So in communities in which SARTs exist, the missions of those SARTs is to facilitate a collaborative victim-centered approach to the prevention and also the response to sexual violence. Victim-centered approach has gained substantial ground over the past years. Significant progress remains to be seen in a lot of areas, but reform in the sexual assault laws has helped to focus the criminal justice response on the protection of women, men, and children, but more attention needs to be paid in whole to the community response, having that community buy-in among the SART team so that we know that it's going to be sustainable when the future, when there's changes in laws and there's changes in the turnover in agencies. A multidisciplinary team such as the SART creates policies and protocols that guide those responses to sexual violence in communities. Policies and protocols ensure that the community response is effective and also that each member addresses the needs of the victim with professionalism and sensitivity. The driving force of being victim-centered is providing that compassionate response, being supportive. In the same way that victim-centered refers to supportive and compassionate, sorry, I've got a sidekick there, my screen just flickered off. Prioritize safety and well-being of the victim. Victim safety, utilizing the victim's input in safety planning. If we don't ask what the needs of the victim are, how can we appropriately safety plan with the victim? Respecting privacy and confidentiality. In rural areas, sometimes this is often a problem, as Sam was talking about earlier. If you have people at the table that are directly involved or related to the victim and or the perpetrator or someone that's responding, can they be objective when they're providing those services? Also, recognize that offenders are always responsible for the assault. We have to work to reduce the victim blaming and the re-traumatization of victims. So offender focus is in the same way that victim-centered refers to providing a thorough, professional, and compassionate response to victims. Offender focus refers to the investigative and prosecutorial efforts made to hold offenders accountable. Offender focus response recognizes that offenders purposefully and intentionally select victims with whom they can successfully commit the sexual assault, meaning that they target those who lack that credibility factor, or they seek out the ones who may not be believed. Offenders are not out of the loop on how the justice systems work. So they go after that vulnerable population that is accessible and lacking credibility. Offender-focused response focuses on the actions and the behavior and the history of the offender and not the victim. A unified commitment. Each SART must demonstrate a commitment to its goals and objectives. If you don't have a unified commitment, your SART is going to be at a standstill. You're going to be walking in place for a very long time. The needs of sexual assault survivors and the needs of the criminal justice system are balanced to ensure that the victim-centered and offender-focused approach is maintained. So ideally, this balance will foster better communication among agencies, which is the primary goal of SART, is to foster that better communication and collaboration among agencies and first responders. Better interagency communication also minimizes the trauma for sexual assault victims when they seek medical and legal help in the community. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we started the SART thing here in West Virginia. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sam to talk about how we started SARTing.
And thank you, Marcia. And I just want to add with that respect to that unified commitment, that those aren't just buzzwords. One of the things that we really recommend to new SARTs within the first few meetings is to sit down and formulate a mission statement, which might include some kind of broad goals about what the SART is supposed to be doing, what the SART is for. And I know that sounds like something that folks could easily just phone in, and it wouldn't be that important. But our experience has been that when SARTs begin treading water, or when a coordinator is unsure of what that next meeting should entail, that going back to the mission statement and taking a look at it can be really useful if it's something that all of the key players have bought into. If they've all participated in creating it and they all feel committed to it, that makes a big difference, and it's a great tool for everyone holding each other accountable and working towards something important. So how we started SARTing in West Virginia, I don't think that's technically a verb, but we're going to go with it. I want to emphasize again that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. This was our process, how we started forming SARTs in West Virginia. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. It doesn't mean that it's going to work in every place just the same. But we do hope that there might be some lessons here which would be helpful for some of you in rural communities. So if you take a look at our map here, you can see that the red flags indicate a county in West Virginia in which there is an operating SART. So we currently have around 22 functioning SARTs, and they're in different stages in development. Some of them are really vital and consistent and have long and impressive histories of improving the service delivery system. And then others of them are brand new. Doddridge County, for instance, has their first SART meeting scheduled for next week, I believe. And so you'll also notice, too, that there are quite a few counties that don't have coverage. And I want to note that in particular because all of us are used to stretching every penny, every resource we have to its absolute limit. And in no way would we say or can we say that West Virginia's system is now the perfect response to sexual assault. But I just want to bring your attention to the fact that every flag on that graphic you see represents a step forward for victims. And so we want to try to get a future where all folks in West Virginia have a response to sexual assault that's beholden to evidence and that's effective and compassionate. That's what we're trying to work for. So as far as our organization's role as the state coalition, the Foundation for Rape Information and Services, we have quite a few things that we do for SARTs across the state. The first thing that we were really focused on in our process of starting SARTs up is making sure that we could provide a whole lot of technical assistance, whether that was pooling resources from the internet about effective SART facilitation, or the best practices for a forensic medical exam or whatever. We wanted to make sure that we were a resource of information for our coordinators and for their SARTs. We also identified pilot sites that we were going to work with more intensely, oftentimes through very specific grant funding. So in other words, we didn't try to eat the whole pie at one time. We took a very particular slice and looked at it closely and tried to say, okay, we're a small coalition, we've got limited resources. What would it look like if we got these 5 or 6 counties going with effective SARTs? some rural, some more densely populated, at least by West Virginian standards. What would that look like? So what we then began to do in some of those communities was to offer training on what a SART would do and why it's important. We created a curriculum for our folks that we just called SART 101, where we would come to a community, we would offer free continuing education credits. We would get as many people in the room as we could, and then we would try to convince them using the best evidence we had available of why it is just so important that we have a coordinated response to this issue. So we wanted to use training as a recruitment tool, but also as a capacity builder. So we continue to do that throughout the state, not just the SART 101 training, but we do trainings on assisting victims with stalking, on the connection between disabilities and sexual violence, on sexual abuse in later life, just to name a few topics. So we want to continue to use that tool as a way of assisting SARTs. We also began hosting quarterly meetings for all of the coordinators to come together in a relatively central location and share insights about what's working and what's not. It's possible to do that with a conference call, but very often we found the face-to-face meeting was really helpful for us. And our commitment to the coordinators when we were going to do something like that is to make sure that the meetings were really, really useful, were really helpful. So we would come to those meetings with a really well-defined agenda. We might do presentations, say, Marcia might do one on a new prevention campaign or a particular kind of victim response or on the neurobiology of trauma. So it would be a real learning opportunity. But we would always leave time for the coordinators to talk together about what their struggles were and what's worked for them. And finally, and this one is just so easy, it has almost no cost associated with it. We started an email listserv for coordinators throughout the state in West Virginia, where we would send out, access to webinars like this one maybe, or where we would talk about the latest research, or where the coordinators would start conversations about problems they were having on their SART. And what we did was we committed to the idea that this was going to be a safe space for discussion. So the only people on this listserv are the actual coordinators themselves and FRIS staff, which has really helped us. And again, those services are free on something like Yahoo. It's really easy to do. So in the early stages of developing SARTs in West Virginia, one of the most important things that we noticed, and we're not the first ones to notice this, by the way, is that developing trust was just incredibly important. It's really, really difficult to have a coordinated community response when people are just sort of vaguely familiar with folks who work in other agencies or work in other parts of the system. Ultimately, kind of what we're looking for is we want people on the SART to be able to trust each other enough to call each other and say, okay, look, I've got this this situation that I'm really struggling with. I've got this victim who has some very particular needs, and it's outside the scope of my usual professional practice. And because I know you, because I trust you, I feel comfortable asking how I should move forward with this. That kind of coordination only happens when there's a trusting relationship. So a big part of what we try to emphasize in the initial stages is how important the boundaries between professionals on the SART actually are. So we're really deferential about how everyone's expertise is important. And we try very hard to reinforce that in a lot of different ways. But if the SART just becomes, everyone come to a monthly meeting and hear the SART coordinator's views on how we should be proceeding, it won't last very long. That's not genuine collaboration, and it certainly doesn't foster a lot of trust. So as with any important pursuit or any complicated pursuit, I mean, relationships are just so critical to this process. If a SART is not a safe space for communicating about potential problems in the system, then we're not going to solve any of them. So one of the things that we work really hard with our SART coordinators at, who are, we have some magnificent SART coordinators, and we're so lucky to have them. But one of the things that we work on a lot is the idea that your advocate hat and your facilitator hat are very different. Again, if the SART meetings are seen as, we're going to go into this room once a month, and the an advocate or a particularly outspoken SART member is just going to tell us how it is for an hour, and then we'll leave. That's not going to help us. And so facilitating a group and allowing the group to solve problems is just so important, and it differs so starkly from the kinds of approaches that we have to take when we're doing direct victim advocacy. And so we think that requires some training. And I think also that part of that relationship process is using the SART to actually assist folks professionally, and that means continuing education, which can be a really helpful part of having a SART. So it's impossible to ask a SART to do something really complex like writing a community protocol without first creating a pretty firm foundation upon which the SART can build. And this is a big part of what we think that foundation should be. We want to understand, first and foremost, why that coordinated response is so important. And it helps oftentimes to make an inventory of what the community resources are, where victims are likely to enter the system. And that's one of the things that we often recommend for the very first meeting, is to make a kind of a resource map. And you heard me talk a little bit about how important the strengths-based approach is to me personally. This is, I think, a really great way to get started on the right foot, and to talk about what our system actually looks like. And again, part of building trust, part of making the SART a safe place to have earnest discussions about how we can improve things, is to have really frank discussions and also policies about confidentiality and informed consent. Especially with brand new SARTs, what we typically do is we try everything that we possibly can to prevent them from discussing cases directly. We emphasize the importance of that system-based language instead of discussing particular cases. So, talking about problems in the system, it's the difference between, I've noticed that at Hospital X we're having some pretty long wait times. Is there something we can do about that, on one hand? And I was with a victim on Saturday, and we waited forever in the hospital emergency room, and it was a problem. The difference between those two statements, I think, is really, really important. And so we try to emphasize that as a kind of a bedrock ideal. We also really wanted to emphasize cross-training, doing trainings with different disciplines in the room at the same time, and that was part of that SART 101 curriculum that I referenced before. So a key component of this is obviously the initial response, which Marcia is going to tell you about now.
As a first responder, it is important to remember that the initial response is to ease the concerns of the victim. You have an opportunity to mitigate the trauma and help the victim on their way to recovery. By doing this, you can listen to the victim. Let them know that you do believe them. And validate those feelings that they're having. Let them know that no one deserves to be sexually assaulted, and in no way any decision that they made did not facilitate that sexual assault. Stop the victim from blaming herself and exhibiting the untruths and also the misconceptions. You can let the victim know that there's no, the assault itself was not your fault. Nothing you did caused you to be assaulted. Often victims apologize for their reactions. So by normalizing common reactions to sexual assault, you can mitigate their trauma and stop any further trauma from happening. A victim that's been through a sexual assault has lost all of their control. So address any questions that they might have. Let them know how the process is going to work, and let them know that you're going to be there for them at every step that you possibly can, that there's advocacy in place. Let them know about the interviews that they will face, and if it goes to prosecution, let them know ahead of time what they're going to face so that there's no surprises when you're moving through the process. You can also empower them and let them make as many choices as possible. Don't give recommendations and don't give advice, but offer options that allow them to make the choice. It gives them back that power to know that they are in charge of themselves. Let them make their own choices. Provide options to the victim give them information and referral options. Let them know this is what is available to you. This is, you can address this at your own time, and you can have an advocate present, or you can do this alone. But we are here to help you, and this is what we will do. A first impression is a lasting one, so it's critical for first responders to thoroughly investigate every case, meet the needs of the individual victims, and provide a coordinated response to ensure victims can fully access services and participate in each step of the process. It's always important to know that what you do and how you respond to victims, how you ask questions, or what your approach, your facial expressions, your attitudes, it has a huge impact on a victim's healing and ability to work with you. So be cognizant of that service that you're providing and the body language that's set forth and facial expressions and how you respond to questions that victims might ask. So we're going to talk a little bit about evaluation. In West Virginia, after SART teams were established and were meeting at least quarterly, some monthly, depending on where the SART team was at, we wanted to know, okay, what kind of services are we providing? Are we meeting the victim's needs completely? And so we came up with a way to evaluate the process, and we incorporated and implemented modified safety audits. And this is just a tool that was used to identify any gaps in the agencies that are providing services to victims. It was a series of questions that asked things like, do you have a policy in place? Are you operating under a protocol? How often are you trained? Do you have an internal policy on response to sexual assault? And we had the SART team work on this together. Each person that was representing an agency would work with the SART coordinator, and they would answer these questions together. And it wasn't a means to point the finger to say, oh, well, you're doing this wrong or you're not doing that. It was a tool that gave us the information that we needed to use to alleviate those gaps, to fill in where the additional services were needed. Identify training needs. With staff turnover, a lot of times training on sexual assault is minimum or non-existent. So as long as the SART team was aware of what training needs were there, then they could reach out to the state coalitions to come in and provide trainings on whatever they felt that they were lacking. Also, memorandums of understanding and protocol development. We served as a driving force to provide extensive technical assistance and feedback for protocol development. Each of the SART coordinators worked with their SART teams. It wasn't a one-person thing. The entire team worked to develop those protocols. And as a state coalition, we worked with them to review those protocols. And we looked at the national protocol. We looked at our state protocol. We made sure that everyone was working together, that teams were coexisting, and that they didn't leave any service out, that every step of the way it was covered. And in doing those two evaluations, the modified safety audit and the protocol development, and we identified those gaps, it showed us that there was a need for advanced SART trainings. So one of the trainings that we developed was an advanced SART training, and we worked to train the SART teams and the agencies that were represented on some of the things that they felt like they were lacking. It was just an additional training for specific populations. One of the things that we uncovered when we were doing the programmatic assessments and we were doing the safety audits is that West Virginia has a large disability population, and one of the areas that we needed to focus on was being 100% accessible to people with disabilities. So we provided advanced SART trainings on that topic, on how to work with people with disabilities, and also how to work with adults in later life.
Okay, so, I'm sorry, go ahead, Marcia.
Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, if you can't tell, we're in different states now at this point doing this, so we might talk over each other from time to time. So I want to talk in particular about a recent legislative advance that we made that we're really excited about and certainly really proud of. And by recent, I mean actually in this past spring that the governor of West Virginia signed a bill into law that we hope will pretty dramatically reform our system of providing care to victims in hospitals. And basically what this bill was focused on was setting up a kind of regulatory system so that we could try to ensure that no matter what county that we were starting from or what county a victim was in, that she would have access to appropriate and timely services and hopefully increased access to SANEs throughout the state. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that bill, we hope, is going to be put into place. And I really do want us to whenever possible, to have that eye on these kinds of broader policy changes because I think that there's so much to do in a kind of immediate sense to help victims that it's easy to lose sight of this part of it. But you all are the experts on sexual assault, on perpetrator behavior, on what kinds of things victims go through. And very often I worry that we don't channel that expertise into the public discussion in a way that we probably should. And we're indebted to the work of a whole lot of wonderful people for passing this bill. But basically what it will do is establish two bodies. One is the Sexual Assault Forensic Examination Commission, and this is a statewide body that is going to be composed of FRIS staff, of advocates, of law enforcement folks, of hospital administrators, who will ultimately help make legislative rules that will regulate what kind of care hospitals have to provide and communities have to provide to sexual assault victims. And the way we're going to do that is not by making big sweeping mandates that we know that communities can't follow through with. Instead, what's going to happen is that each community, probably each county or in some cases a region, if it's really sparsely populated, will have a sexual assault forensic examination board. And that is a county board that is interdisciplinary, that ultimately the prosecutor in each county is responsible for making sure that this happens. And what they're going to get to do is sit down and meet and develop a county plan for how we are going to respond to victims of sexual assault in Ohio County, in Marshall County, in Hardy County or Kanawha County. And that is just so important because a lot of what that can do is force us to do some of the same things that we were talking about in the early SART process. So if every community has to get together and form an interdisciplinary committee to formulate a plan, that sounds a whole lot like a SART. Right? And as a matter of fact, the bill even says that if you have a SART in your community, then you can use that as the place where this discussion happens. So one of the residual benefits of this bill, we hope, is that it's really going to spur some additional SART development as well. So in this case, I'll just briefly run through some of the things that this statewide commission is going to be empowered to do. The rules, legislative rules, that process in most states takes quite a while, so we won't be sure exactly what regulations will be put in place for a little while. But we know some of the broad goals that the statewide commission is compelled to pursue, and you can see some of them there: to facilitate recruitment and retention of qualified medical professionals to do these exams, have minimum training requirements for providers conducting the exams. Those two things are incredibly important. In a rural community, for instance, that only has one SANE, the level of care that a sexual assault victim could get could vary widely based on whether or not that SANE is on duty. So if we have these minimum standards, do we have a way to encourage folks to have more SANEs on staff? We hope that the answer is yes. So establishing a basic standard of care. This is true for basically every other procedure or problem that we address in the medical field. It ought to be true for care for victims of sexual assault. There ought to be basic standards. And you can see some of the others there, that trying to make rules that facilitate transportation for victims in the event that there's not a hospital in their county, or developing a data collection system to actually monitor, okay, is this just a law filled with broad pronouncements that don't do anything, or is our community really responding to these new mandates? So we're definitely very excited about that. So we want to talk about steps to keep a SART going, because it's not enough just to set them up and have them start meeting and then step back. So Marcia's going to go over a few tips for that.
Okay. An occupational hazard of working in this field is fatigue, and we all are accustomed to that. So it's important to know that when meeting after meeting, it seems like nothing is moving forward, you will also start to see meeting attendance diminish, and sometimes the SART tends to fade away completely, and we want to prevent that. So some of the tips to turn meetings into more than just another meeting is appoint different meeting facilitators. Also, you can allow SART members to help develop the agenda that you're preparing for the meeting. Be open to inviting guest speakers. Also, be open to differing opinions. Address concerns appropriately in a timely manner. Also, use meetings to provide capacity building opportunities. Example, covering toolkits or toolkit modules, or providing a module on confidentiality. Provide those capacity building opportunities among your SARTs. Do anonymous surveys to determine how your SART is functioning. Online surveys. You could do an online survey for your SART team to let people weigh in to say what we think is working, what's not working, and this is our concern, and what can we do to address this. The perils of a boring meeting. I think we all have those meetings that we go to that we feel like we just go to a meeting to meet, and we want to keep that from happening. All SART members endure useless meetings in their line of work. We can't add another one of those to their calendar. And one bad meeting can lead to a pattern of disengagement. If someone attends a meeting and they just feel like banging their head off at the table, the chances of them coming to the next meeting are slim to none. So we want to prevent that from happening as best possible. Advanced planning, or lack thereof, often determines quality of meetings. If you work on an agenda for a meeting 15 minutes before that meeting occurred, that meeting is probably not going to have a successful outcome. So include the SART team in development of the agenda. Ask if there's anything specifically that different members would like to address. send that agenda out ahead of time and let people weigh in on the agenda, and develop a solid agenda will keep this from happening. When having SART meetings, identify a meeting facilitator. It doesn't always have to be the coordinator or the advocate. Identify another person among the group that would be willing to facilitate the meeting. Also identify a meeting note taker so that you can review the notes from prior meetings and you can know what the next meeting needs to entail. Always have an agenda and provide members with meetings and copies of those agendas. Also give all members an opportunity to speak. This is important because you have someone who tends to take the floor at every meeting and just offers one opinion, then you're really not hearing what the other agencies have or what they brought to the table. So arranging meeting dates in advance is crucial. I know that my calendar is always full at least a month ahead of time, so you have to be creative and think ahead when you're arranging meeting dates and what will work for the majority. You're not always going to please everyone's schedule, but it's often what works for the majority. SART purpose and functions. You have different purposes and functions in the different stages throughout the SART. So once a SART is established, meetings may be used to address ongoing issues as well as to identify emerging developments and goals for future development. Inviting inclusive roster members, creating purpose statements, that's all in the building in the development stage. Once the SART is developed, you move into that purpose and function of the established SART. Meetings may be used to address issues like training and information sharing, protocol revisions and modifications, identification of concerns and issues related to response, conducting case reviews, deciding if you're going to do case reviews. Is it in our best interest to do case reviews, or do we have a confidentiality issue? Discussing confidentiality and maybe signing confidentiality statements that will prevent anyone from taking information outside of that SART meeting. In rural communities, that's often a challenge.
Okay, so one of the things that I want to talk about here is some general tips about how to keep things fresh in the SART, how to sustain it, and quite a few of these we actually touched on already. So I'll go through them quickly. We find that cross-training is really helpful. Once we were able to get established with our statewide social work board and with the licensure folks who do counseling and with our law enforcement folks, once we got established as a provider of continuing education, we found that cross-training was really helpful for getting folks in the room, for informing them about the latest research. I assume that in most other states that this is a problem, that a lot of professionals have continuing education requirements that they have to meet, and they're often very costly. So what we've done in the past is provided that service at minimal to sometimes no cost at all in the service of getting someone in a particular community in the room and talking about sexual assault. So we also have found that protocol development is a really important piece of what SARTs can do, and we've talked a lot about the reasons why. Case review can be really important if it's done with an advanced SART, and again, if it's done using that system-based language rather than identifying details. There will almost certainly be some people on the SART who don't have professional or statutory reasons that they have to be strictly confidential. And so in small communities in particular, that's going to involve airing the concerns of victims in a way that we would just never want to do. And so having that system-based language, talking about problems in the system in multiple cases rather than identifying details, is just so important. And finally, creating opportunities to show respect for each person's roles, whether that's the coordinator knowing to ask members of other disciplines explicitly about, as the chief of police, how do you feel about X? Or whether that's doing some co-presenting, which we'll talk about more here in a second. That's really important. So a few more of these tips here. Shared participation is just so critical. First of all, it's not very easy for a SART coordinator to come up with new things to talk about every single month. That gets hard after a while. So it's that's one reason to do the shared participation. But the other reason is that people feel more engaged when they can participate, when their expertise is valued. So one of our strongest SARTs in Harrison County, the coordinator there will frequently ask members to do presentations of their own. And another one of our strong SARTs in Kanawha County that do the same thing. So that's an opportunity to keep people engaged and to avoid the perception that a SART is just a platform from which the SART coordinator can say what they think about this issue. It's not. It's about collaboration. And if we do that, if we have people who have some experience facilitating besides just that SART coordinator, then we can have a little bit of an easier time dealing with turnover when that happens. If there's a little bit of institutional memory on the SART, that's so important. And that last bullet point there, build a system, not just a person. In some cases in West Virginia, we've had SART coordinators who are just so extraordinary that it gets hard to imagine how a SART would go on without them. While that's certainly a credit to their job performance, it's also a real problem for the system. So I cannot encourage you strongly enough to have co-facilitation and to have multiple people who would be capable of helping. So a few quick words about a subject close to my heart, which is data gathering. I'm a numbers person. I really like research, and I really think that any pursuit that is as incredibly important as reducing sexual violence deserves a systematic response, one in which we're accountable for results and where we try very, very hard to recognize what we're doing that's working and what we're doing that isn't. I know that this is a struggle for rural communities. I know that the perception is, gosh, how would we ever find the time or the resources or the money to do data collection? But what I want to emphasize here is that data collection doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to do a double-blind study with a sample size of 10,000 and random selection. You don't have to do that. You can get a lot of valuable data with small sample sizes and almost no cost. And I just want to talk about a few things that we've done. We did a SART assessment, which was just a survey of members of SARTs throughout West Virginia about how they thought their SART was functioning, what they thought they needed to improve, how often they were meeting, that kind of thing. And we did it all for free on an online service, of which there are many. SurveyMonkey is one. And we just sent it out on our listservs, and we collected data that way. Now, is that perfect data that we could publish in a research journal somewhere? No, absolutely not. But we were able to glean some really important insights from that data that showed us some areas where we needed to improve. We also get informal feedback from SART coordinators at those quarterly meetings that we mentioned. We have a West Virginia SART, which is a statewide partnership of directors of rape crisis centers who can give us feedback that way. The modified safety audits that Marcia talked about before have just been invaluable in terms of us being able to show improvement and to show where we need to continue to go. They've also been helpful, by the way, in terms of building relationships. They've provided an excuse for a SART coordinator to get in the same room as an otherwise elusive member of another agency. So they were really helpful in that way. So this idea that we can't do any data collection, I think, sometimes gets in our way. We need to see what's working, what's not, and I want us to try that because I think this is just so important. So there's a recent study by Rebecca Campbell, who is far more qualified and smarter than I am, and I don't want to misrepresent, but it's worth noting here that she did a cluster analysis where she divided the SARTs in her sample into some different categories, and you can see them there. SARTs in the low adopter cluster, they tended not to have diverse membership. They tended not to be doing protocols and engaging in some of the formalized processes that we'd like to see them do. Then these high adopters who are doing a lot of work. But then you'll notice there's the difference between those two categories. High adopters accept evaluation versus high adopters plus evaluation. So what she was seeing was that the SARTs where the members thought they were the most effective were the ones engaging in evaluation of their efforts. So we can't say, based on that evidence, that if you just do an evaluation, everything's going to go well. Your SART will be healthy and perfect, and we can't say that. That's not what the research says. But what I think we can say safely is that there are some really highly successful SARTs out there who are making an effort to collect data about what they do. So I think, copying that practice makes some sense. Also, clearly, making the SART inclusive is just so important. In rural communities, sometimes there's a perception, from people outside it as if there is no diversity in rural communities, and that is just almost never true, regardless of the kinds of things that we hear. So remember, again, that we want to be treating things as in a strength-based way. Having a diverse SART is an incredible strength. It's incredibly important, particularly when we realize that a lot of populations in the literature have a greater risk for sexual violence, and you can see some of them in the bullet points below. Two of the initiatives that we've done recently, doing widespread cross-training on sexual abuse in later life and assisting victims of sexual violence who have disabilities, have been incredibly well received, and we think really important because those are two high-risk populations. So if we don't prepare ahead of time to appropriately address the diverse needs of clients, we're going to fail some victims. And so I want us to have that in mind when we can. And we want to be prepared also for conflict resolution on any SART. But given the tremendous diversity in the roles and responsibilities of SART members, there should be a conflict resolution policy in place. So a lot of the nature of the conflict can center around things like confidentiality that we've discussed before. But sometimes a lot of it is just in the nature of how we talk about things. If we have an understanding that the SART meeting is not going to become a kind of a finger-pointing blame fest, but one in which we talk about system-wide problems in a mutually respectful way, then we can avoid a lot of this in advance. So Marcia's going to talk about what we're looking for in terms of success.
So I am like Sam. I'm not a numbers person. However, it is those numbers that determines or defines our success. And I'm talking about statistics here. The number of arrests, the number of prosecutions, the number of convictions, the number of survivors seeking advocacy. Those statistics are going to tell you, how are you doing? Where were you when you started and where are you today? Goals achieved? Are you achieving your goals? Is there an improved response to victims? Is there a more victim-centered care for victims? Is there an increase in the number of victims coming forward? Is there more requests for advocacy? Is there better quality of evidence collection as a result of what's taking place among your SARTs? An improved systemic response. Is there an increased percentage of victims reporting to law enforcement? Are victims expressing greater satisfaction with the care that they receive? Are more law enforcement cases being referred to prosecution? These are all ways of determining if your goals are being achieved. So with that being said, that brings us to our questions and comments. So we're going to open up the floor. Sam and I will be available for questions or comments if anybody has any questions.
And I want to emphasize too, by the way, Marcia, that one thing I forgot to mention in the evaluation section is that the folks who are putting on this webinar, Leah among them, and the Sexual Violence Justice Institute, they just have such an amazing array of resources to help with these kinds of things. And if you call them, they have been so helpful to us. And I want to recommend that really strongly. And I certainly know, Leah, we're running out of time, and you probably want to facilitate some questions. But I hope you won't just treat those folks like a distant group of people whose website you access sometimes. Give them a call, ask for help. They're really, really a great resource for us.
Right. Thanks so much. Yeah, please reach out to us, and we really work with you when you call or email to help you identify your question around evaluation and data, and then help you match different resources we have and different approaches. So, yes, take advantage of us. Well, thank you so much, Sam and Marcia. And we have a few minutes, and we do have a number of questions. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the questions, and you can comment on them. So a couple are just some logistical ones. One person wanted to know about how to get the SART handbook, and I think the link was a little off in the formatting. So what I'll do, too, is make sure that that link is available on the email that goes out to all the attendees on this session.
Thank you.
Yeah. And another person wanted just to know a little bit more about the SART 101 curriculum, if that's something that can be shared with other state-level leaders, or your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. There are several SART 101 curriculums, and you don't have to recreate the wheel. In that handbook that we had in there as a resource, that actually has a lot of the curriculum in it. But if you're looking for something that's already put together, my email is at the bottom of this PowerPoint. If you would like to email me, I could certainly send you a PowerPoint that we have used in the past.
Great, perfect. And I love that too, because I think we all get better when we share what's worked well, and also lessons learned. So that's a great mindset to have. All right, another question. Somebody in the Midwest here in Fort Dodge, they're in the process of starting a SART team. Is there any kind of information or thoughts that you have on just some wisdom and some insights on starting a SART?
Wow. What I would say to you, is it specifically in a rural area?
Yeah, I know the city here, it's fairly rural, yeah.
All right. What I would tell you is probably the biggest lesson that I have learned as being the project coordinator on developing multiple SART teams is don't expect to do it in a day, a week, a month, or even a year. A lot of times, because of some of those challenges and barriers that we discussed in the presentation, it often creates sort of a roadblock, but you do eventually get there. So don't let it deter you from the overall goal that you're headed toward. There's just a few bumps along the way, but and as we said before, and as we reiterated throughout the presentation, every area is different. So I really don't know if there's any best practice other than what we've covered today, but I would certainly say that Sam and myself would probably be more than willing to answer any questions that you have throughout your development phase.
I'm sorry, Marcia, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say one thing that I think is really important is especially in those initial stages, is to think relationally. And it's the difference between being perceived as a friend and a colleague or as kind of like a telemarketer. And I think sometimes we get to that ask too fast. So, we might send out an email without ever having met someone, inviting them to a SART meeting, or asking them to be their agency's representative on the SART, or a phone call or something else that is relatively impersonal. And what I really emphasize to a lot of new SART coordinators is to try and make relationships with the key players first. And it doesn't mean you have to conceal your intent or anything like that, but it does mean that there's something there's something less effective or off-putting about just immediately adding something to someone's plate. We need to be able to show them that it's going to be helpful to them, and that it's going to be a good collaborative process as opposed to a contentious one. So I think that's the most important thing in those early stages.
Great, thanks. And I would add to, listening to your presentation, the slides, when you're talking about development first and then purpose and function, I'd really encourage team leaders to really think about it in stages and phases too, and that development and how they can create a foundation and create the conditions for successful really collaborating and teaming on down the road. Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we take one more question, and then we'll sign off. So I'm going to go to this question because I think it's fairly common. One person wrote in that on their SART there's a lot of talk about current cases, and oftentimes it tends to turn into a gossip session. Mm-hmm. And it's just not really feeling unproductive and not really where they should be going to, and all sorts of other unintended consequences. I'm sure that we could flesh out with that too, but that's something that I commonly hear as well. So what are your insights and perspectives on that?
Sam, do you want to weigh in on that, or would you like me?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. This is something I think that we need to return to a lot. As a matter of fact, one of the findings from the SART assessment that I mentioned, where we surveyed SART members across the state, one of the things that we found as a result of that survey was that in a lot of SARTs, the confidentiality policy hadn't been updated recently or revisited recently. So we really encourage folks to devote, at least one meeting solely to developing a confidentiality policy that everyone can kind of sign on to, and then updating it at least annually. We also have our on the sign-in sheets for when people attend a SART meeting, there's a reminder, like a concise 1 or 2 sentence summary about what our confidentiality policy says. And so one of the things that we definitely try to encourage SARTs to include there is that we're not going to do this direct case discussion. And instead what we're going to do is we're going to use that system-based language. We're going to kind of distill the concerns or the obstacles that we're seeing in a variety of cases and talk about the problems in the system. I noticed that the wait times in the hospital are a bit too long, right? That's not identifying. And really the particular details of a case I find are often not particularly helpful in terms of guiding larger system change. And in a rural community, it's almost impossible to predict what detail you can describe about a case that would out a victim. And that's the thing that we're really most concerned about, is because if you mention, there was an incident that happened at such and such a bar or in such and such a park or in such and such a neighborhood, very often there might be somebody in that room who hasn't had occasion to work with that particular victim and who now knows who it is as a result of having this kind of gossipy case discussion. So to me, it's a situation that offers a whole lot of risk with some pretty questionable benefits. And so having that confidentiality policy for your SART is just so important in my view.
Great, thank you. And I would just add on that too, we have quite a few resources for teams to approach that and how they can really use cases as a learning mechanism, as an evaluation, while upholding all of what Sam and Marcia were just saying. And 3 different types of approaches. We have a past webinar, so there's my information. Feel free to email me or call me. And again, just a plug for if you're looking for technical assistance or support, that we are available to you. So I hope that we hear from you. And Sam and Marcia, thank you so much. It was great learning from you. We really strive and want to create a really learning environment with us from all across the states. And thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your commitment and all the conversations that you had with me prepping for this webinar.
Well, thank you, Leah, and also thank you for everyone who attended. Please don't hesitate to contact us, and thanks for the work that you do.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
With that, I'm going to stop the meeting and sign off, and I hope everybody has a good day out there.
Thanks, Leah. You too.
Okay.
Thank you.